High Consul Zixtaler's fourth set of eyes twitched nervously as he reviewed the security footage for the seventh time. His crystalline appendages clinked against the control panel, a clear sign of distress that made his junior advisors retreat to a safe distance. On the holoscreen before him, a human female walked through a Category 9 acid storm, protected by nothing more than a thin layer of synthetic material she called a raincoat. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice modulator crackling with stress harmonics. "Run atmospheric analysis again." The computer chimed its compliance. Atmospheric fate level in documented zone 1.2. Temperature 62 degrees Celsius. Radiation level 350 millirems per hour. Subject identified as Dr. Jessica Anderson, Environmental Sciences Division, Earth Restoration Course. The security feed continued, showing Dr. Anderson stopping to collect samples while humming something she had labeled in her notes as "Walking on Sunshine." The irony of her musical selection, given the caustic rain dissolving everything around her, was not lost on the High Consul. "Summon the Emergency Council," Zixtaler commanded, his voice harmonics reaching frequencies that shattered 3 nearby crystalline data storage units. Priority level. Extinction event. Within 30 minutes, the Grand Chamber of the Arxillian Collective filled with the planet's highest-ranking officials. The council members' bioluminescent patterns flickered with anxiety as they settled into their hoverpods, creating a disco-like effect that would have delighted their human observers had any been present. "Esteemed members of the council," Zixtaler began, his translator working overtime to remove the panic frequencies from his speech. 6 planetary rotations ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected an unauthorized research vessel in the outer reaches of our system. Initial scans identified it as human in origin, but we dismissed it as a random exploration unit. We were wrong. So very wrong. The holoscreen activated, displaying footage from multiple surveillance drones. The council chamber erupted in harmonic screams as they watched Dr. Anderson and her team systematically documenting their world's environmental degradation. The humans moved through lethal environments, with casual disregard for danger, treating deadly conditions as minor inconveniences. "But surely their protective equipment," began Defense Minister Crawlfor. "That's just it," Zixtaler interrupted, his crystal segments nearly vibrating apart with stress. "Watch this." The footage shifted to the human research team's base camp. Dr. Anderson and Commander Michael Reynolds sat at what they called a picnic table, consuming their midday nutrients. The temperature read 51 degrees Celsius in the shade. Neither human showed signs of discomfort. Instead, Commander Reynolds was adding some kind of red substance to his food, something the humans labeled as Dave's Ghost Pepper Hot Sauce. "By the first crystal," whispered Science Minister Vexthor, "they're consuming capsaicin for pleasure." "What kind of species does that?" "It gets worse," Zixtaler continued. "They've already mapped 43% of our major industrial zones, documented our atmospheric deterioration, and—" his voice modulator cracked, requiring a reset before he could continue. "They've started taking soil samples." The chamber fell silent. Taking soil samples was a clear precursor to environmental intervention. The humans weren't just observing. They were preparing to help. "The last species that tried to help us." Minister Vexthor didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone remembered the chlorophyllians who had attempted to assist with their agricultural crisis. Their methods, while well-intentioned, had proven incompatible with Arxillian biology. The resulting disaster had taken decades to contain. "But these are humans," Zixtaler emphasized. "The same species that terraformed Mars in under a century. The same species that reversed their own planet's toxic death spiral through what they called sheer stubbornness and a lot of overtime. The same species that considers radiation suits to be, and I quote, optional safety gear." The security feed's final clip showed Dr. Anderson examining a toxic waste processing facility. She took notes on what she called her phone while standing in a puddle of radioactive runoff, pausing only to unwrap and consume something labeled as a protein bar. "We must act now," $6 declared. "The humans have already decoded our transmission frequencies. It's only a matter of time before they try to make official contact. We need to protect our world from their help." The council chamber erupted into chaos, crystalline appendages clinking in terror as members argued about how to handle the impending human intervention. None of them noticed the small drone outside the chamber window, where Dr. Anderson was already documenting their world's governmental infrastructure with cheerful efficiency. Intelligence Chief Nick Sferen's presentation to the Emergency Council started with what he considered the most disturbing footage yet: Commander Michael Reynolds swimming. "As you can see," Nick Sferen gestured with 3 of his crystalline appendages, "the human leader deliberately immersed himself in the Western Toxic Sea to rescue what he identified as a baby seal-like creature. Our sensors confirmed the water temperature at -15 degrees Celsius, with acidity levels that should have dissolved organic matter on contact." The footage showed Commander Reynolds emerging from the caustic waves, cradling a squirming juvenile Zexaphy in his arms. The aquatic creature, known for its aggressive defense mechanisms, seemed oddly calm as Reynolds wrapped it in a thermal blanket and began administering first aid. "But that's impossible," protested Minister Vexthor. "Zexaphy secrete neural toxins when threatened. Even our environmental suits can't withstand direct contact." Apparently, Nick Sferen's voice modulator crackled with stress. "Human skin is partially resistant to Zexaphy toxins." Commander Reynolds reported only mild numbness and what he described as that funny feeling you get when you sleep on your arm wrong. The council chamber's atmospheric processors struggled to maintain stability as the collective anxiety of its occupants caused widespread temperature fluctuations. The next segment of footage didn't help. Technical Officer Amanda Hayes appeared on screen, halfway inside a malfunctioning atmospheric processor. Her lower body dangled from an access panel 40 meters above ground level, while she casually chatted with her team below about something called weekend plans. "Note that she's wearing what humans classify as basic protective gear," Nick Sferen highlighted. "A simple fabric coverall and what they call a dust mask. She's breathing air that would crystallize most species' respiratory systems." High Consul Zixtaller's bioluminescent patterns shifted to deep ultraviolet, a sign of extreme distress. What are they planning? Surely they're not just here to help. That's the most terrifying part. Nick Sferen brought up a new holographic display. "We've decoded their mission parameters. They're part of something called the Environmental Protection and Restoration Corps. Their sole directive is, and I quote, to assist planets in need of environmental rehabilitation, because someone ought to do something about it." The display showed clips from the human team's daily operations. Dr. Jessica Anderson conducting soil surveys in radiation zones hot enough to fry their best scanning equipment. The team's geologist, Dr. William Cooper, cheerfully explaining local tectonic instabilities while standing on what their sensors identify as an active fault line. And most bewildering of all, their weekly ritual called Dave's Extra Spicy Chili Cook-Off. "We've analyzed the chemical composition of this chili," Nick Sferen continued, his crystalline structure vibrating with horror. "It contains concentrations of capsaicin that our scientists classify as a chemical weapon. They eat it for entertainment." Security footage from the human base camp showed the team gathered around their outdoor cooking station. Commander Reynolds stood proudly over a steaming pot, while Technical Officer Hayes argued that real chili doesn't have beans. Dr. Anderson added something called jalapenos directly into her bowl, an action that caused 3 junior council members to flee the chamber. "But why here? Why now?" demanded Minister Vexthor. Nick Sferen's next display showed their planet's deteriorating atmospheric readings. They detected our environmental crisis from 3 systems away. Apparently, humans have developed specialized sensors for identifying planets in need of, as they put it, a helping hand. The final clip showed Dr. Cooper explaining their mission to his personal log. "Sure, the Arxilians haven't technically asked for help yet, But look at these pollution levels. Their ecosystem's gonna hit critical failure in less than a decade. We can't just sit back and watch that happen. Besides, their atmospheric toxicity is only about twice what Earth's was during our Industrial Revolution. Nothing we can't handle with some good old-fashioned elbow grease. The council chamber fell into stunned silence, broken only by the sound of crystalline appendages clinking nervously against hoverpod controls. They think our environmental disaster is manageable. High Consul Zixtaler's voice modulator nearly shorted out. What kind of hell world did these humans evolve on? Actually, Nixferin brought up Earth's historical environmental data. You don't want to know. Security Chief Kralvor prided himself on maintaining composure in any crisis. He'd handled meteor strikes, industrial accidents, and that embarrassing incident with the self-aware cleaning robots. But watching the human team's morning routine through the surveillance feeds had him seriously considering early retirement. "They're doing it again," he reported to the council, his crystalline structure vibrating at frequencies that made the chamber's windows hum. The humans are engaging in what they call their morning jog through the Valley of Perpetual Storms. The footage showed Commander Reynolds leading his team through terrain that the Arxilians had classified as instantaneously lethal 3 centuries ago. The humans wore nothing but light synthetic garments they called moisture-wicking running gear and breathable mesh shoes. "Our latest countermeasures have proven ineffective," Kralvor continued, trying to keep the defeat out of his voice harmonics. "The automated cooling systems we installed to deter their approach actually made them more comfortable." Dr. Anderson called it perfect running weather. High Consul Zixtaler's bioluminescent patterns shifted through 7 shades of distress. "What about the electromagnetic deterrent field?" They're using it to charge their personal devices," Kralvor admitted. Technical Officer Hayes said it's, and I quote, "better than solar charging." The council watched in horror as the surveillance feed showed Dr. William Cooper stopping mid-run to collect rock samples from an active geothermal vent. The temperature readings around him exceeded the boiling point of water, yet he complained only about his water bottle getting too warm. "We've implemented every security protocol in our archives," Kralvor brought up a holographic checklist. "The sonic barriers designed to disrupt their neural patterns. They think it's soothing background noise. The gravity modulators we use to make movement difficult. They called it resistance training. And the chemical deterrent spray." He paused, his voice modulator crackling with embarrassment. "What about the spray?" Minister Vexthor demanded. "They bottled it and use it as a condiment. They call it ranch dressing." The chamber erupted in harmonic wails of despair. 3 junior council members had to be escorted out when the next footage showed Lieutenant Emma Martinez conducting what she called basic maintenance on their atmospheric processors. She bypassed their most sophisticated security locks by simply asking a maintenance worker for access, claiming she was just having a look around. But the most disturbing development, Kralvor's crystalline segments clinked nervously, involves their attempt at cultural exchange. The holographic display showed Dr. Cooper approaching the facility's cafeteria with something he called homemade sourdough bread. The innocent-looking offering caused an immediate evacuation when sensors detected that he had cultivated microscopic organisms on purpose to make it. "He's growing bacteria for consumption," Kralvor explained to the horrified council. "Deliberately. And worse, he's offering to teach our food preparation units how to do it too." High Consul Zixtaler's hoverpod drifted erratically as he processed this information. "Are you saying they not only coexist with microorganisms, but actively cultivate them for pleasure?" "It gets worse." Kralvor brought up another security feed. "They've started what they call a community garden outside their base camp. They're introducing earth vegetation that thrives in our toxic soil. The plants are already spreading beyond their designated containment area." The footage showed Dr. Anderson cheerfully tending to rows of green plants, handling soil that would corrode most environmental suits. She called it therapeutic and had started inviting local maintenance workers to participate in what she termed garden therapy. "The workers are actually showing interest," Kralvor admitted, his voice dropping to panic frequencies. 3 of them asked about starting their own gardens. We're losing control of the situation. The council chamber's atmospheric processors struggled to keep up with the collective anxiety emissions. The final footage showed Commander Reynolds setting up what he called a weekend barbecue station, complete with an actual combustion-based cooking apparatus. They're planning to intentionally burn organic matter for food preparation, Kralvor concluded, in the open air, and they've invited the entire maintenance staff to participate. High Consul Zixtaler's bioluminescence faded to a dull panic gray. Have we become so desperate that we're considering their help? A notification chimed through the chamber speakers. Alert. Human life signs detected in previously quarantined zones. Multiple instances of unauthorized environmental restoration in progress. The Council's worst fears were confirmed. The humans had already begun. The Arxilian central government complex had been designed to withstand planetary bombardment, economic collapse, and even the dreaded audits from the Galactic Revenue Service. Yet none of its architects had planned for Lieutenant Emma Martinez simply walking through the front door. I just asked for directions, she later explained to Commander Reynolds through their comlink. The maintenance worker was super helpful. Did you know they can change colors based on their emotional state? That's so cool. The Council's security feeds captured the moment in excruciating detail. Lieutenant Martinez, wearing what humans classified as business casual attire, chatting with a now violet-hued maintenance worker about the building's ventilation system. The worker's helpful explanation of their atmospheric processing units had unknowingly bypassed 17 layers of security protocols. She's inside the main complex, Security Chief Kralvor announced, his crystalline structure vibrating at frequencies that threatened to shatter nearby data crystals. And she's taking notes. The emergency response teams arrived to find Martinez sitting cross-legged next to an air purification unit, happily sharing her lunch with 3 junior maintenance workers. The sight of her casually consuming what she called a peanut butter and jelly sandwich sent the response team into retreat. You're processing biological matter between sliced bacterial colonies, one horrified observer asked. Want half? Martinez offered, causing a second evacuation of the entire floor. High Consul Zixtaler watched the chaos unfold from the supposedly secure council chamber. Perhaps, he suggested, his voice modulator struggling to maintain official frequencies, it's time to accept the inevitable and arrange a formal meeting. The first official contact session was scheduled for the following day. The council prepared their most secure meeting room, equipped with every environmental safety measure available. They didn't expect the humans to render them all irrelevant within the first 30 seconds. Oh, these suits, Commander Reynolds said, already removing his protective gear. We just wore them to be polite. Your atmosphere's actually pretty similar to Earth's industrial period. Kind of nostalgic, really. The revelation that humans could breathe their toxic air unprotected caused 3 council members to freeze in place, their crystalline structures locked in patterns of pure shock. The situation deteriorated further when Dr. Jessica Anderson began a presentation on their environmental findings. Your calcium-based life forms are fascinating, she enthused, gesturing with a skeletal appendage that the council now realized was inside her body. The crystalline structures are similar to some earth corals, though obviously more advanced. Speaking of calcium, anyone want a latte? I brought my portable espresso maker. The council chamber emptied for the 3rd time in an hour. The concept of humans voluntarily ingesting calcium-rich substances, the same material the Arxilians used for starship hulls, proved too much for many members. Look, Commander Reynolds addressed the remaining council members, who had retreated to the far end of the chamber. We understand your concern, but your planet's environmental crisis is reaching a critical point. We've seen this before. Earth went through something similar about a century ago. Your species survived conditions worse than these, Minister Vexthor asked, his hoverpod drifting nervously. Survived. Technical Officer Hayes laughed, checking readings on her tablet. We thrived. Turned the whole mess around. Sure, it took some elbow grease and overtime, but nothing beats the satisfaction of saving a planet. The final straw came when Dr. William Cooper, attempting to lighten the mood, began explaining the concept of human bone density. "Really interesting evolutionary adaptation," he said cheerfully. "Our endoskeleton actually gets stronger under stress. We call it weight-bearing exercise." The Council's collective horror at realizing humans had evolved to become sturdier when damaged caused the chamber's emergency systems to activate. As decontamination protocols engaged automatically, Dr. Anderson caught a falling data crystal that would have shattered on impact. "Nice reflexes," Lieutenant Martinez commented. "Thanks. Rock climbing really helps with hand-eye coordination. Speaking of which, I noticed some interesting geological formations in your quarantine zone. Anyone up for a weekend expedition?" The resulting silence was broken only by the sound of the High Consul's voice modulator shorting out completely. Dr. James "Jimmy" Thompson adjusted his holographic display, while the Arxillian Council watched from what they considered a safe distance, approximately 30 meters away, behind portable radiation shields. The human environmental historian had insisted on giving what he called a quick PowerPoint presentation about Earth's environmental restoration. "So, picture this," he began, pulling up an image that made several council members emit distress frequencies. "Earth, circa 2075. Average temperature, hot enough to fry an egg on the sidewalk. Literally, there were cooking shows about it. Atmospheric carbon levels. Let's just say breathing optional was becoming the trend." High Consul Zixtaler's crystalline structure vibrated with morbid curiosity. "And your species survived these conditions?" "Survived." Dr. Thompson chuckled. "We had summer music festivals in that weather. But yeah, it wasn't great. Ocean acidification was turning our coral reefs into underwater ghost towns, and the smog in major cities had gotten so bad, we started painting murals of blue skies on buildings to remember what they looked like." The presentation continued, showing images that the Council's archivists initially classified as psychological warfare. Beaches covered in plastic waste, rivers that caught fire, and skies the color of engine exhaust. Yet in every catastrophic scene, humans could be spotted going about their daily lives, apparently unconcerned by conditions that would qualify as weapons-grade environmental hazards on most worlds. "Here's my favorite part," Thompson said, switching to a graph that made Minister Vexthor's hoverpod short-circuit. "We hit rock bottom around 2080. Global temperatures were up by 4 degrees Celsius. Half our coastal cities needed floating barriers just to keep the ocean out, and our pollution levels," he whistled. "Let's just say your current situation would have been considered a nice day in old Beijing. But your planet is now classified as a Class 1 environmental paradise." Security Chief Kralvor protested, his voice modulator crackling with confusion. "How?" Dr. Thompson's grin made several junior council members retreat further behind their shields. "We rolled up our sleeves and got to work. Started with the basics: massive reforestation projects, ocean cleanup initiatives, atmospheric carbon scrubbing. You know, entry-level stuff. The next series of images show humans physically planting trees in contaminated soil, diving into acidic oceans to restore coral reefs, and constructing enormous atmospheric processors in conditions that the Council's safety protocols classified as instantly lethal. The real breakthrough," Thompson continued cheerfully, "came when we realized we needed to work with the environment instead of against it. For example, we discovered certain bacteria that actually thrived on plastic waste, modified them a bit, and boom, our ocean garbage patches became all-you-can-eat buffets for our microscopic allies." The concept of deliberately cultivating and modifying bacteria caused 3 council members to excuse themselves for emergency decontamination procedures. "Of course, not everything worked on the first try," Thompson admitted, showing footage that the Council would later classify as extreme horror. Humans in minimal protective gear testing experimental environmental restoration techniques. Through trial and error, we had some setbacks. The Great Pacific cleanup of '85 was particularly spicy. Lost a few drones, gained some interesting mutations in the local seaweed. But hey, you can't make an omelette without occasionally creating a few temporarily bioluminescent fish species. Commander Reynolds stepped in, noticing the Council's increasingly panicked bioluminescent patterns. What Dr. Thompson is trying to say is that we've been through exactly what your world is experiencing now. Your atmospheric toxicity, about half of what Mumbai dealt with. Your acid rain, practically tap water compared to what fell on London in the bad years. Your radiation levels. He checked his personal detector. Honestly, I've gotten worse exposure from forgetting sunscreen at the beach. The Council chamber's atmospheric processors struggled to handle the collective anxiety emissions as the humans continued their presentation. The final slide showed Earth's current status, a thriving, restored ecosystem that had bounced back from the brink of collapse. The best part, Dr. Thompson concluded, we've got this down to a science now. Your situation. We call this a standard restoration project. Give us 6 months and a decent coffee supply, and we'll have this place looking like a nature documentary. High Consul Zixtaller's voice modulator finally gave up entirely, producing only a high-pitched whine that perfectly matched the Council's collective mood. The humans were going to help them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Field Operations Director Kate Sullivan stood before the Arxillian Council wearing what she described as standard field gear, a reinforced jumpsuit that made several council members question their understanding of the word standard. Today's demonstration will cover basic environmental restoration techniques, she announced, unpacking equipment that their sensors struggle to classify. We'll start with something simple: toxic waste cleanup and soil rehabilitation. The Council watched in horror as Sullivan casually lifted a container marked with radiation warnings. Now your contamination levels are pretty mild, only about 3 times the old Chernobyl exclusion zone. Nothing a good chelation treatment can't handle. Mild. High Consul Zixtaller's replacement voice modulator squeaked. That area is designated as a never enter upon pain of instant death zone. Oh, that's cute, Sullivan chuckled. We used to have those signs too. Turned most of them into coffee tables after the cleanup. Speaking of which, Ryan, you ready with that soil sample? Restoration specialist Ryan O'Connor emerged from what the Arxillians had classified as a Class X hazard zone, carrying a bucket of glowing soil. His only protection was something the humans called a respirator and rubber gloves. Found some interesting bacterial growth in there, O'Connor reported cheerfully. Reminds me of that cleanup job in old Detroit. Remember that one, Kate? The soil was so toxic it melted our first batch of sample containers. 3 junior council members had to be escorted out for emergency crystal structure stabilization. Now watch carefully, Sullivan continued, demonstrating what she called basic decontamination procedures. The Council's collective horror grew as she and O'Connor physically handled contaminated materials, introduced engineered bacteria, and occasionally stopped to take soil readings with handheld devices that seemed impossibly primitive. The key, O'Connor explained while literally digging his hands into radioactive dirt, is working with the natural recovery processes. These little guys, he held up a vial of what he called helper bacteria, love munching on heavy metals. Give them a few weeks, and they'll clean this soil better than any mechanical filter. The concept of deliberately introducing microorganisms caused Security Chief Crowvor to emit panic frequencies that shattered nearby monitoring equipment. But that's not even the best part, Sullivan added, pulling out what she called a starter kit for their environmental team. We've developed a training program to get your local workers up to speed. Basic stuff: radiation safety, toxic waste handling, extreme weather protocols. Should only take a few weeks. The training session that followed would later be described in council records as the Great Terror. Human standards for personal protective equipment proved to be disturbingly minimal. Their definition of acceptable risk caused several safety officers to resign on the spot. and their casual approach to hazardous conditions made the Council seriously consider evacuating the entire planet. Remember, Sullivan demonstrated to a group of terrified maintenance workers, if your radiation detector makes this noise, you've got about an hour before you hit your daily exposure limit. Perfect time for a lunch break. The situation reached peak anxiety when the humans proposed team-building exercises. Commander Reynolds arrived with equipment for something called paintball, explaining it would help develop necessary skills for environmental work. It's great for building situational awareness, he enthused. Plus, it's fun. Nothing brings a team together like hunting each other through toxic waste zones while shooting colored capsules. The Council watched in mounting horror as more humans arrived, each carrying what they called basic field kits. Dr. Anderson started a vegetation restoration project in a zone so contaminated it made their sensors malfunction. Technical Officer Hayes began retrofitting their atmospheric processors with modifications she designed over lunch. And worst of all, Dr. Cooper started teaching local workers about something called composting. Your people are adapting really well, Sullivan reported to the Council, beaming with pride. They're already asking about advanced techniques. One of them even volunteered to help with tomorrow's acid lake neutralization project. High Consul Zixtaller's new voice modulator produced a sound remarkably similar to a human whimper. They weren't just accepting human help. They were beginning to embrace it. The emergency alarms blared through the Arxillian Central Complex with a harmony that suggested imminent doom. The Western Continental Atmospheric Processor, responsible for keeping a quarter of the planet's air breathable, had suffered a catastrophic malfunction. Estimated toxic gas release will render the entire Western Hemisphere uninhabitable within 6 hours, Minister Vexthor reported, his crystalline structure vibrating at frequencies that threatened to shake apart. Evacuation protocols air. Hey folks, quick question. Emergency Response Coordinator Jack Marshall interrupted, strolling into the Council chamber while checking readings on his tablet. Anyone mind if we try something a little unconventional with your runaway processor? The Council stared in horror as Marshall pulled up schematics of the failing facility. Behind him, his team was already gearing up with equipment that the Arxillian safety protocols classified as woefully inadequate for survival. The containment chamber is reading at 180 degrees Celsius. High Consul Zixtaller's emergency voice modulator crackled. The radiation levels alone would. Little toasty, yeah, Marshall nodded, pulling on what he called his heavy-duty work gloves. Reminds me of that reactor issue we had in New Phoenix. Remember that one, Cooper? Good times. Dr. William Cooper looked up from where he was adjusting his boots. Oh yeah, that was the one where we had to manually override the cooling systems. My hazmat suit actually melted a bit on that job. Had to expense a new one. The Council's collective bioluminescence shifted to ultraviolet frequencies of pure terror as the human team prepared to enter conditions that their best environmental suits couldn't handle. Now we've got two options, Marshall explained, sketching a quick diagram that made several safety officers faint. We could try the traditional evacuation route, but given the wind patterns, the toxic cloud would still hit your major population centers. Or, he grinned, causing 3 council members to retreat behind their hoverpods. We could pull what we call a manual override. Quick and dirty, but effective. Dr. Anderson's already got a bacterial culture that should help neutralize the gas once we get the processor back online. You want to physically enter the facility. Security Chief Kralvor's voice modulator hit panic frequencies and introduced bacteria to our atmospheric system. Better than breathing toxic gas, Technical Officer Amanda Hayes commented while checking her radiation detector. Besides, the bacteria are pretty cute once you get to know them. I named some of them. The Council watched in stunned horror as the human team set up what they called a basic field operation. Dr. Jessica Anderson prepared cultures of her helpful little friends, while Lieutenant Emma Martinez established a command center using equipment that looked suspiciously like camping gear. All right, team, standard hot zone protocols, Marshall announced. doing stretches that the Arxilians recognized from their horror archives as yoga. Hayes, you're with me on the primary coolant system. Cooper, you and Anderson handle the bacterial dispersal units. Martinez, keep the locals calm and maybe start a pot of coffee. This might take a few hours. You're treating this like a routine maintenance check, Minister Vexthor observed, his crystalline structure trembling. Pretty much is, Marshall shrugged, checking his oxygen tank. Bit warm, somewhat radioactive, chance of instant death if we mess up. Just another Tuesday, really. Though I might need to submit overtime for this one. The human team moved with practiced efficiency, entering the facility through access points that the Arxilians had sealed as permanently lethal. The Council's monitoring systems tracked their life signs with morbid fascination as they penetrated deeper into the failing processor. Temperatures rising. Hayes reported over the comm system, her voice cheerful despite the hellish conditions. Jack, this reminds me of that volcano monitoring job in Hawaii. Remember the marshmallow incident. Please focus on preventing planetary extinction, High Consul Zixteller pleaded. Multitasking. Marshall's voice crackled through. Cooper, how's that bacterial delivery system looking? Ready to rock. Though I think we might have accidentally created a new strain that glows in the dark. Anderson wants to name it. The Council's horror at the casual genetic manipulation was interrupted by a series of massive clanking sounds from the processor core. The facility's readings began to stabilize, toxic gas levels dropping as Anderson's bacterial cultures went to work. See, Marshall emerged 2 hours later, his suit showing signs of heat damage, but his grin intact. Nothing to it. Though I might need a shower, it was a bit sweaty in there. Anyone up for pizza? I'm thinking of ordering for the whole team. The Council's only response was a collective whimper as they realized this was probably just the beginning of human help. High Consul Zixteller stood before his office window, all 4 sets of eyes twitching as he watched the scene below. A group of humans and Arxilians were planting something called a community garden in soil that, just 3 months ago, would have dissolved standard environmental suits. The latest environmental report, Consul, his assistant's voice modulator hummed with resigned acceptance. I believe the humans call this a progress update. The report made his crystalline structure vibrate with a mix of terror and amazement. Atmospheric toxicity levels had dropped by 60%. The Western Toxic Sea, once capable of dissolving metal, now hosted something the humans called a surf competition. And most disturbing of all, local children had started a junior environmental club under Dr. Anderson's guidance. They're teaching our young to cultivate bacteria, he whispered, watching a group of younglings learn about composting. But his personal crisis was interrupted by an even greater concern. Word of their planet's rapid recovery had spread through the galactic community. The result? More humans. So many more humans. Latest count shows 15 new environmental expert teams requesting permission to establish permanent offices, his assistant reported. They're calling our world a fascinating challenge and a perfect training opportunity for junior restoration specialists. Through the window, he could see Commander Reynolds teaching a group of previously dignified council members how to operate something called a recycling center. The council members, their crystalline structures gleaming with embarrassing enthusiasm, were actually enjoying it. Did you know, his assistant added, somehow making the voice modulator convey excitement, that Technical Officer Hayes has modified our atmospheric processors to be 30% more efficient. She did it during her lunch break. She called it a quick fix. The consul's horror at their dependency on human innovation was compounded by the arrival of Dr. Cooper, who had somehow gained access to his supposedly secure office. Great news, Cooper announced, brandishing a tablet. Those bioluminescent bacteria we accidentally created last month. Turns out they're excellent at detecting atmospheric pollutants. We're thinking of implementing them planet-wide. Also, we're having a barbecue this weekend to celebrate. You should come. Before Zixteller could engage his emergency escape protocols, Lieutenant Martinez poked her head in. Oh, and the local community center asked if we could start teaching earth gardening techniques, something about reconnecting with nature. We're thinking of starting with tomatoes. They grow great in slightly radioactive soil. The consul's private communication device chimed with a message from the Galactic Council. They wanted to know if the humans would be willing to help with other planets' environmental issues. Apparently, several civilizations had been impressed by the before and after holovids that Dr. Thompson had been casually sharing at the last Galactic Conference. Did you see what they did with the acid rain catchment areas? His assistant enthused. They converted them into something called water parks. The cleanup crews are using them for team-building exercises. Outside, a new group of human environmental experts had arrived, their ships landing in areas that were previously quarantined as eternally toxic. They were already unloading equipment, setting up monitoring stations, and worst of all, planning more community outreach programs. Final report for today, his assistant chirped. The human-designed Environmental Education Center is ready to open. They're calling it the Earth and Arxilia Partnership for Planetary Restoration. Dr. Anderson has already enrolled 30 young Arxilians in what she calls scout programs. High Consul Zixtaler sank into his hoverpod, his bioluminescence pulsing with resigned acceptance. He began composing his final report to the Galactic Council. Emergency update. Human environmental restoration efforts have exceeded all expectations. Our planet's ecosystem is recovering at unprecedented rates. Local population showing disturbing enthusiasm for hands-on environmental work. Request immediate assistance in managing excessive human helpfulness. They're organizing weekly nature walks, teaching our children about earth vegetables, and suggesting something called camping trips. He paused, watching Dr. Anderson lead a group of enthusiastic younglings in planting trees that somehow thrived in their toxic soil. Most alarming development. Our people are starting to enjoy it. Send help immediately. The humans are making our planet too healthy, and we're running out of excuses to stop them. The report was interrupted by the cheerful sound of Commander Reynolds testing the new public address system. Attention everyone. The weekend cleanup crew signups are open. And yes, we're having another potluck. Don't forget, Earth Chili Cook-Off champion Dave is visiting next week. The High Consul's only response was to quietly short out his final voice modulator. They had won. The humans had helped them, whether they wanted it or not.